Hi, folks. Today we're talking about sexual violence and sexual assault. We need to keep in mind that sexual assault and the concept of sexual assault varies from time to time, and it does vary from culture to culture. And it is strongly related to gender and sex and gender roles and sex and gender dynamics within our society. We're also, as we talk about this chapter, we're in a period of incredible change, incredible social change in our society, where there's much more widespread recognition within the culture of powerful men who have committed acts of sexual assault and sexual violence against women over and over again. And there are much more efforts to the Me Too movement, particularly, to stop and truly arrest that behavior in men and to change the culture of toxic masculinity. And so this is a great time for talking about sexual assault and sexual violence. And at the same time, there's a lot of traditional structure within our society that has effectively dug in on committing to very conservative ideologies that threaten women's rights and make it easier for environments to support sexual assault and other kinds of violence against women. So we need to talk about definitions of rape. We're talking about forced sexual behavior that does not recognize consent. We're talking about forced sexual behavior without the consent of the other person. We're also looking at circumstances wherein a yes was worked out, and so working a yes out where a person is put into a violent situation where they have no true choice, where it's, oh, okay, I can either get stabbed or I'll go along with this. And so doing that, of course, is ultimately rape and is indeed grounds for rape. And so we have not always had this definition of rape or this acknowledgement of power dynamic or power dynamic possibilities within relationships of one kind or another. But nevertheless, in this year where we're looking at the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage, we're looking at how much has transpired in terms of women's rights, women's reproductive rights, which ultimately relate to their rights to have power and ultimately dominion over their bodies. We're looking at the evolution of thought and ultimately where we stand today in some of the cultural discourse regarding sexual assault, particularly sexual violence against women. A lot of the data that I'll be talking about comes from the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network organization, rainn.org, and they have some great data about the topic that gives greater context to what sexual assault ultimately involves. So we overwhelmingly know from their data that the rapist is not a masked stranger. So we're looking at overwhelmingly acquaintance circumstances being the preconditions, if you will, for a great majority of sexual assaults. And so what often is operating is that the individual is using, the assailant is using that knowledge or that contact, prior contact, if you will, or knowledge of the victim to victimize that person. They're using it to their advantage, so to speak. They may have seen a person across campus, know that a person that they victimize is a friend of a friend, something like that. And often we let our guards down, if you will, in those circumstances. And in so doing, when we're around these folks and we're recognized as, oh, okay, oh, I remember him or I remember her, that becomes in some cases something that the assailant will use to his or her advantage. So overwhelmingly, in 2/3 or more of the cases, we're looking at it within those circumstances. Often these assaults take place in comfortable settings, in homes, apartments, dorm rooms. Again, it's often a very known experience, particularly for the victims. And I'll also use the word survivor. Again, there's language that goes back and forth within the literature about the use of victim and survivor. And so survivor is one way of recognizing the will or the agency of the person who was raped. And so it's a way of saying this individual has dignity, they have worth, they have an identity beyond what happened to them, in spite of the need, of course, to acknowledge that they are not defined by the rape or by the assault. Victim is ordinary parlance that we use typically in legal and criminal justice settings, legal proceedings and what have you. And so it's, as it's traditional, a shorthand, but I will use both of the terminologies of victim and survivor interchangeably. So, yeah. So the victimizer or the assailant is able to use those known environments where there's comfort. They use that to their advantage, and that's ultimately how they can sort of, in a sense, make survivors more vulnerable to the experience. And so that's often what we're looking at as someone who has, as the assailant, as the rapist, they have great capability in reducing vulnerability in others, reducing their vulnerability, or I should say, making them more vulnerable. Maybe that sounds better. They are able to make the person more vulnerable in ways that the individual might not recognize. And again, that does take a certain skill and a certain commitment for it to occur. Again, currently within the political economy of our society, the culture, there's much more direct discussion and challenging of structures related to toxic masculinity, particularly as represented by the Me Too movement. Nevertheless, we still see within state governments and state legislatures much strident, resistant to women's rights and women's reproductive rights. And even though human trafficking, which is a part of sexual violence against women and the subcultures of such within our world, even though human trafficking is much more of a known word or a known parlance, at the same time, what's the reality? How much are our municipalities, our counties really doing on a regular basis to ultimately protect and preserve the rights and opportunities and lives of women? So therein much work needs to be done. There are some theories that are posited to explain how and why rape occurs. And so one example is the psychopathological theory. This ultimately says that rapists are sick people and that is why they rape. And so the idea is that, well, it's such a dreaded, terrible act that the person would have to be compelled by something irrational to do it. Very attractive theory, a very attractive prospect, but research does not bear this out. The research does not indicate that rapists are any more capable or, if you will, based in psychoses or schizophrenia or other kinds of mental illnesses. Another way of looking at this is what we also know as derogation of the victim, or sort of victim precipitation theory. And so this sort of way of looking at how rape occurs explains it in terms of the vulnerability of the survivor or the victim. So they'll say or explain it in terms of, well, what was the person wearing? Where were they? What time of the day was it? So they'll look at those things, and it's almost a blame the victim. A sort of, well, okay, well, you know, she or he should have known better, those kinds of things. And again, no evidence. There's nothing evident in such assumptions. The assumptions are ultimately sexist and are ultimately based in the subjugation and derogation of women. And so that is why such thoughts and notions do sadly persist. We know from a feminist and sociological standpoint that rape is about power, and it's about dominance, and it's about control, and it's about assailants dominating and controlling survivors, and about imposing their will on survivors. And that it's a tool that has been used over and over again to repress women, to repress dominated subcultures within society to as an instrument or a tool of war. It's been used as a way to dominate slaves. So it's ultimately a reflection of culture and subculture, and particularly of power dynamics within any given society.